questioning is perhaps the greatest gift we have as human beings.
Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking.
It's a way of thinking that teaches us to question everything we think we know.
Science came about by developing techniques, methodologies for gaining reliable knowledge about the world.
We have at our fingertips the technologies that were only possible for the largest governments and corporations 20 years ago as an individual today.
If the human civilization continued at anything remotely like the current pace of technology advancement for 1 million years, where would we be? I think we're either extinct or on a lot of planets.
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it.
We hold the scientific method in high regard because it works. If it stopped working, we'd throw it out.
Discover the past.
Create the future.
This is the Here and How podcast.
Welcome to the Here and How podcast, where every week we dive deep into big ideas, exploring the past so that we can create a brighter future together. This is episode 11. Is there a soul? I'm your main host today, Thomas Westbrook, and I'll be leading this episode, but I'm joined by two magnificent co-hosts, Rachel Oates and Stephen Woodford. Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
So I'm kind of wondering if you guys, I think I know where most of you fall on this episode, but have you at one point or other in your life believed in the notion of a soul?
Yes, no. I have, yeah.
Stephen has? Rachel?
No, not really.
No.
Nah, I've always just kind of like I believe in like a consciousness, but I don't think it's like a soul, like an essence that's separate from the body.
But are you kind of scientifically open-minded to the notion, the concept of it, if I were to prove it?
Oh yeah, if you proved it, yeah.
Okay, so we'll try to approach this scientifically and objectively. I know that it is a little bit of a contentious subject where most people from religious perspectives tend to be, they adhere to this notion because they see that as what lives on after we die. But I want to kind of dive a little bit into the history of this notion, this idea of the soul, where it came from, or at least specifically mind-body dualism, not the soul as a whole, because I mean, that goes back to, religion. It's hard to pinpoint where this concept originated. But I want to kind of look at this notion that like the mind and body is separate, and then maybe explore some of the science of like testing it and why we think that there is or isn't a soul. Sound fun?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm up for this.
So how many of you have heard of the notion of mind-body dualism?
Yep.
Yes.
Do you know where it originated?
I want to say Immanuel Kant. Kant. Yeah.
It was you call it a Kant.
This notion, it's also referred to as Cartesian dualism, if that gives you a hint.
Yeah, Cartesian. That makes sense.
Like René Descartes.
Yep.
Oh.
The guy who said, I think, therefore I am.
Yep. Cogito ergo sum, or the cogito. Yeah. So he had this notion of, Descartes is kind of famous for trying to get down to the bare minimum of like, what do we know without knowing anything else? And he kind of got down to this idea of like, I think, therefore I am. Like, I cannot doubt the existence of my mind, right? He thought of, everything else, you're not sure. Are you in a simulation? Are you a brain floating in a vat? I don't know. But I know that I think, therefore my mind must exist in some way, shape, or form.
It's an incredible insight. And for me, even now, and I don't really think, I can't see a way past it. It seems to be the only thing that I know with 100% certainty. That is just that I am something and that I'm conscious in some form. That's all I know with 100% certainty. And it just puts us in such a weird predicament.
Yeah, so he divided the world into kind of, two different types of substances or whatever. He had, kind of the more like physical stuff that like is hanging in space, that is like, a rock that is purely like a physical substance. And then he had things that are more like spiritual substances, which would be like a soul or God or like the divine realm or something. At least conceptually, we can kind of make this distinction. And he called this substance dualism, where you have mind stuff and physical stuff. What would be an alternative theory to this?
An alternative theory. You want to go at that one, Rachel?
No.
Yeah.
So the alternative would be reductive physicalism.
Okay.
Where basically you say everything is physical.
Okay.
Okay.
So all the mind stuff, the thoughts and stuff is generated purely from the physical world. It's not separate from it.
Okay, right, okay.
Oh, okay.
I see.
So that's kind of like what I believe.
Yeah, I'm more on line with that, but I wouldn't go so far as to assert that everything is physical. Rather, I would just say that the dualism hasn't met its burden of proof, and therefore we have to rely on what we do know with as much certainty as we do, and that would be the latter. But yeah.
So then Descartes pushed it one step further with this notion of like interactionism, which is that like your mind affects the mind stuff can affect the physical stuff. So like the soul kind of has a gateway into your body, and he said it was through the pineal gland. And which that wasn't really based in, he basically said that all the rest of the parts of your brain have I'm thinking he said that because they had like mirror images like on each side, but like the pineal gland stood alone, therefore it must be the gateway that the soul comes through. And it wasn't really based, they didn't have any kind of neuroimaging or anything at the time, but it was an interesting notion, but it still begged the question of, okay, how does it affect, how does the soul or the mind affect the brain? How does this external puppeteer move your brain around, which is physical, if it's non-physical? And so that led to the mind-body problem. How can a purely mental thing affect a physical thing? So there are a couple of objections to this. What do you think some of them may be?
Going back to your second definition, that is that the mind is actually a product of physical elements, physical reactions, and therefore this isn't actually a problem at all. It's just conceived as such because we see it in that way, whereas actually it doesn't function that way at all.
Okay. Rachel? Can you see any problems with this notion, this theory?
I guess I'd say, like, if the mind is like a non-physical thing, then how do we test to see if it's there? Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Is it unfalsifiable?
Yeah. Like, because the only like evidence we have is essentially anecdotal of like, oh well, I know my mind is there, but then how do you go and test that other people have a mind without just like getting stories from them? Do you know what I mean?
Well, and it kind of comes to the notion of how can you test the supernatural world?
Yeah.
If it with purely natural tests, like with purely, if you can only detect the natural, then if the supernatural affects the natural world, would it not be part of the natural world?
Yes.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah.
Now, one way around that I would postulate is that if the supernatural world is completely undetectable, but it still affects the natural world. So, for example, if I pray for you and you have a miraculous cure, like you just get better all of a sudden, then this is something that we would be able to test in a lab, because we can't necessarily we can't look at prayer stuff under a microscope, but we can determine, what is going on. Like, is there a higher rate of recovery with prayers?
Yeah.
And they've done this.
Tests have been done, yeah.
Yeah, they've done prayer studies that have examined, I think there was one that was over 100,000 patients and with cardiac conditions, and they measured recovery rates, and they had 3 different samples where one didn't know that they were being prayed for, one did know that they were being prayed for, and one wasn't prayed for at all.
Yeah, no.
And the ones that weren't prayed for and the ones that didn't know that they were being prayed for, there was absolutely zero difference between recovery rates. And the ones that knew that they were being prayed for actually fared worse, because there was kind of this added pressure of oh no, I have to do better and get better quick because, I don't want to let down my faith or something. Or at least that's the postulated reason for, why they think they may have had worse recovery rates. But it's still if prayer worked in this case, you would expect that they would that there would be some type of increased rate of recovery. Now, the proponents of the supernatural or the apologists might say that, oh, well, it doesn't work because you can't test God, or skepticism interferes with the experiment. But that just makes it like they still haven't satisfied the burden of proof, and it just pushes it back to this untestable realm of kind of pseudoscience.
Yeah, it is.
And so Descartes, one of the reasons that he said that the mind and the body were separate is that he have you heard of Leibniz's law?
Ooh,
I'm not sure.
I have heard of it. I can't recall it.
So Leibniz's law says that two things with completely identical properties are really only one thing. So for example, if let's say that I hold up a cup of coffee and I say, I have 2 cups of coffee. They're just completely identical, including their position in space and time. Well, that's really only 1 cup of coffee. Like, it's exactly identical in size and space and everything. And so, you can't say that that's 2 objects. They have every single property in common, including their location. So it's really only one thing. So Descartes kind of took this notion. I don't think he knew, I don't think Leibniz came along until later, but basically Descartes said that, took the converse of this notion where if they have different properties, they must be different. So he said, I can doubt my mind, but I cannot doubt my mind because, I think, therefore I am, right? But I can doubt my body. Therefore, they must be different. What's the problem?
He mean? He can doubt his body. What does that mean?
So if you think about it, you're like, well, my body might not exist, right? I might just be some floating ethereal thing. Like, I can doubt the existence of my body.
Yes.
And I can logically reason that I'm just a brain in a vat, or I'm in a simulation, or I don't really exist. But I cannot doubt the existence of my mind. I know I'm experiencing something, therefore there must be something there.
You can, depending on how you define mind, you can doubt almost everything that's mental. The thing that you can't deny is that at least in some form you're conscious. That's it. You can't confuse that as being that your mind can't be mistaken. That's obviously wrong.
Yeah.
That's to say that you can be wrong. Basically, we know this. This is absolutely the case. Is that the angle you were?
Well, what Descartes was trying to show was that because they have 2 different properties, because you can doubt your body and its existence, but you cannot doubt the existence of your mind. Like, your mind, it exists. Your body, you're not sure it exists. Therefore, they have different properties. Therefore, they must be 2 different things. You must have a mind and a body. You must have a soul and a body, like 2 separate entities.
What do you mean by mind? Or what did he mean by mind?
I would say like some type of separate, something that is not physical, that is kind of a separate seat of consciousness.
It seems quite begging the question, depending on what route we're going down here, because I don't want to jump ahead, but the mind is a product of the brain, and the brain is physical. And without that brain, there is every reason to think that the mind won't exist. Yeah, but I don't want to jump too far ahead.
We've never seen proof of a mind without something physical, but we have seen proof of physical without the mind.
Yeah.
Well, one of the big problems with Descartes' proposition is what's known as the masked man fallacy. So let's say that you go into a ballroom and you see a masked person, right? You can look at that person and say, I know what my dad looks like, but I don't know what this masked person looks like underneath the mask. And so therefore, because they have different properties, then it can't possibly be my dad. Right? That's, you kind of take it to that. It's reductio ad absurdum. But you take that notion, you're like, what you think about something isn't necessarily a property of the thing itself.
Yeah. You confuse the map for the place.
Yes. Another example of this is, if Lois Lane is like, I think that Superman, or I know that Superman can fly, but I don't know that Clark Kent can fly. Therefore, they must be 2 separate people. It's like, well, actually, it is the same person. It's just, what you think of it doesn't affect its own properties.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So then, as a result, it's like that doesn't necessarily disprove mind-body dualism. It just is a fallacy of argument, right?
It just shows that the conclusion that he inferred is invalid.
Yeah. So how would you go about proving the existence of a soul? How could you show that there is something separate from the body? Like what are some different ways that, people have tested this? Are you aware of any tests or any claims people have made that they're like, aha, that's proof of a soul?
People used to do things with like weighing the brain and weighing the body before and after death to see if there's any like difference in the soul leaving the body. I know people used to do that forever ago.
I think also the biggest argument for a soul, and maybe this is where you're going to go with the history of it, is that similar to free will, but nowhere near to the same extent, we naturally have just evolved to basically see when someone dies. If you've seen someone that's dead, or even if you've seen a pet that's dead, it's not your pet anymore. You immediately recognize that. You recognize that for biological reasons that we're not entirely sure about yet. But what we do know, for example, is that it's very good for you not to be around dead bodies, and therefore we just have unconscious biological reactions to dead bodies that make us think it's no longer that thing. I don't need to care for it. We need to do what we must with it. But one of the side effects is that if you have a loved one and your loved one passes away, something's gone. And it's very hard to just look at that and go, oh, okay, that thing's gone for good. It's like, well, where did that go? And so that seems to be a good reason for why this concept of a soul originated. Because it's easy to confuse that it's easy to illogically infer that means that whatever it is, it's now somewhere else.
But can you think of any proof for the existence of a soul? Like that's kind of a discussion of like where the idea might come from. But like as far as how would you prove its existence?
Prove its existence for a soul.
I guess you'd want to try and get some proof of a soul existing without the physical thing being there. So,
it's like, it kind of like goes back to what Rachel was saying about having some kind of agent that doesn't have a brain, that doesn't have what we could conceive as a mind.
Yeah.
That's one way of doing it, but I don't want to push it to such a position that the problem is that where we are not making this assertion, there is many ways that you could prove it. It's just it's kind of a strange question, because I'm here just going, present me your best, and then I'm going to take it on and see whether or not it's true, rather than me myself thinking, what ways could I prove something that I think is at this point demonstrably not true?
Like, there's lots of things you could try, like trying to see like what happens to a physical body after someone dies. You could try and kind of extract a soul somehow. If you could try and see like what happens if you mess with someone's brain and see if that affects their mind and their personality, which we know it does. But then that kind of proves that the soul isn't separate. It proves that it's a physical thing. You could try and do something where you like try and put the soul of one person into an inanimate object, and you try and animate something that's inanimate and see if it has a soul. I don't know, there's lots of things you could do. Just
I think
none of them have worked.
While they're so the reason that those, for example, are so absurd is the reason why me and Rachel are reluctant to even mention them. So let us know.
So a couple ways that you could test something like this. I already mentioned like testing miracles through things like prayer studies, and testing it against the rate of like a control group's recovery rate, or the rate of spontaneous remission of like cancer and things like that. But another thing that you could do, some people have, you mentioned weighing the body before and afterwards, right? Which I don't know why the soul would have weight, because if it had weight, wouldn't it be held to this earth? Like it would have, it would be affected by gravity, right? But there was a guy, Dr. McDougall, who put forth the 21 grams theory, where he basically said, he's like, I weighed a body before and afterwards, before it died and after it died, and I tried to account for everything else in the room, but it basically lost 21 grams. Well, there was a couple of problems with this. One, his sample size, he only had 6 patients that he tried it on, and only one of them really lost 21 grams. Like, he had, like, I think there were like 2 of them that that they lost some weight and then they lost more like right afterwards. And then there was like one that lost it and then gained it back, and there was like one that like it didn't affect at all, like nothing happened. But he tried to, he tried to go about this scientifically, and he even measured animals to see like, did they lose any weight too? And he found that dogs didn't, they didn't lose this 21 grams. But
did he account for things like gases in the body and things like changing in mass as they degrade and stuff?
I'm not sure that he did, because I heard one source say that he did, another said, he didn't.
Okay.
It's a little unclear, but either way, like, so this experiment was done like in the early 1900s. It has never been replicated, and it's very scientifically suspect, especially given that he had a tiny sample size. Yeah. It happened to some of them, not others. To some, they gained it back. To some, they lost more. Like, to just say flat out that the soul weighs 21 grams is a really big stretch. Now, as far as dogs not experiencing this, one objection was that when your body, right upon death, oftentimes like your lungs stop operating, and so and the rate of oxygen going through your body and cooling it off, like that stops, and so your body actually for a brief period increases in temperature, and you sweat some, and as a result of that, like, they say, well, what if the sweat accounts for some of the lost weight, because dogs don't sweat?
That's a good
so
point.
it was kind of an alternative theory that was put forth. Either way, like, it's a far-fetched to say that, that's your soul. That would be saying that your soul has weight, which, if it's
not physical, then
and not physical, how would it have weight? How would it, be bound by the laws of physics?
Mm-hmm.
So another guy tried to photograph the soul.
Oh, I've heard about things like this.
His name was Dr. Konstantin Korotkov. And this one is literally like one of the worst examples of like pseudoscience propagated on the internet. Like, I was searching for this story, and there was like a YouTube video about it that had like millions of views, but it was like pulled from this really, really like poorly sourced forum or like blog on the internet. And like, trying to track down the original stuff and original citations was hard. But
was
also,
he one
like,
of these guys who would like get someone against a white background and shine a light at them, and then like photograph the very edge of like their outline to see what color their aura was? Have you seen people doing that?
Well, he might have done that too, but like he tried to photograph like bodies, corpses, like as they were dying and stuff. And there were the only pictures. There's one like YouTube thumbnail that's literally, it's just like an artist's rendition. Like, it doesn't actually show anything. And then like there's pictures and stuff on like blogs where that they'll show that apparently the pictures themselves came from like a sauna, had like a infrared image and stuff, and they weren't actually like his photographs. But when I started reading this thing, like instantly it screamed woo. Like, he talks about how, oh yeah, there's like micro levels of photons that we're able to detect using like the quantum energy and stuff. It like starts just throwing out just garbage, like word salad. And there's no replication of this. It's extremely poorly sourced. They don't actually show the photographs that I'm aware of. And even still, even if you're able to show, that, for example, if you look at a body before and afterwards through, under ultraviolet, or you examine the ultraviolet spectrum or the infrared spectrum, like you'll see a decline in heat. That's just going to happen. Like, your body is, it might initially spike and then it's going to cool to room temperature. And as that happens, you're going to notice that like, oh, hey, like I see less, like there's because there's no heat being given off, it's going to look different. That doesn't mean that you're photographing a soul. That doesn't mean that you see something physical that's leaving the body. Have you guys ever looked into people who like, photograph auras and orbs? You mentioned that briefly, Rachel.
Yeah, it's a load of crap. There are people who like try and photograph orbs and stuff, and most of the time it's just like dust particles in the air and things like that. And anyone who knows even a little bit about how like a camera lens works will know that it's absolute crap.
Yeah.
Same with like auras and things like that. It's like you do get what's the word? You get like a kind of halo effect often, especially with digital cameras. You get that on a lot of images anyway. And so just like, you know, lights hitting things at different angles and stuff. Of course you're going to get something that looks like an aura on things. Like, hell, my bookcase would probably have an aura if I photographed it. And it's just a little camera kind of...
On the note of that as well, there's a YouTuber called Captain Disillusioned.
Oh, I love him.
He's fantastic. Like if you want to see the limitations of cameras, etc., specifically cameras, I think, and you want to know how exactly certain things happen and how can we explain this aura or that there's a ghost in the background. He does a fantastic job of explaining why these things happen.
I saw him do a brilliant one on like the apparent ghosts at Disneyland.
Oh, that was actually just about to mention that one. That's
I'm sorry.
No, you go for it. It's one of my favorites that he's done.
Yeah. It was like, because he was saying how they were on VHS tapes, weren't they? And they were like recorded over. And so part of it had kind of like been burnt onto the tape. And so when the image was recorded over, it kind of ignored all the stuff that stayed the same, like the trees and like the fences and things like that, because the camera was in the same place.
Yep.
And it just had like a kind of ghostly kind of blob floating across the screen looking like someone walking. And it was just like the burnt on remains of the last footage.
Yeah.
Quite interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool. He really explains a hell of a lot with the digital world and how these things happen. So
yeah,
very
he's an amazingly intelligent guy, and he's so funny as well.
Yeah, he's brilliant. He's absolutely awesome.
Yeah, a lot of these images, you know, can be accounted for through either double exposure or through dust particles or through like smudges on the lens of the camera itself.
Yes.
Or if, depending on your shutter speed, you know, or your film rate, if the person moves and the camera has a really slow shutter speed, then it will look blurry. It'll look, you know, kind of fuzzy or hazy.
Yeah. Me and my sister took a series of photos of, like, they were long exposures in a really dimly lit room where I would, like, stand in one place, shine a torch on me, move to another, shine a torch on me, and it looked like there were two of me in the same photo. And it was only, like, one exposure, one photo, but it was just a camera trick.
Yeah.
You know, there's loads of stuff you can do like that. Yeah, sorry.
There's another one too where it was a picture of like some fairies by a waterfall, and I'm trying to remember the exact details, but this was like back in like the early 1900s, and like I think it was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, who like he believed in like psychics and fairies and stuff. And this hoax was put forth there were a couple of girls who basically said like, look, we photographed these fairies out by our garden. And then, I forget who it was really skeptical of it and was like, well, why is it that like their wings were still, but the water behind them was like blurry because it was moving? And it's like, if they're actually, their wings are like flapping or something, wouldn't their wings be like blurry too? And then like decades later, like right before they died, like the girls came forward and said, oh, it was all a hoax and here's how we did it. And so like it's
nice.
There's a lot of people that just would have said, no, there's a supernatural element where, you know, sure, the nature reacts that way, but they're supernatural. They don't react that way.
Or the
so
water was just flowing faster than their wings were flapping, so it just looked like their wings were still, but they weren't. They were just flapping really slowly.
Exactly.
But like if you put something like this forward, you're more likely to get exposure than if you debunk something. You know, it's like the phrase, a lie moves halfway around the world before the truth has time to put on its shoes.
Yeah.
And so when you see stuff like just pictures or things like that, like look at the source, be a little bit skeptical, you know, going into it. So a couple of objections that I want to put forth to this notion of mind-body dualism is, and I'm going to get into as well some other pieces of evidence for it, like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and stuff like that. But I want to talk about the question of, what does the soul do? Like, what makes your soul your soul? What is it that the soul does that the brain doesn't, that the body doesn't? Like, what would you guys, if you were arguing the case for the soul, what would you say that the soul is responsible for?
I would define, if I was arguing for it, and so far as I've had from religious people who I know who do advocate a soul, they basically say that your consciousness is your soul, and that is the ghost in the machine. And when you die, that ghost in the machine will go to another plane, if you will, where you'll be judged by a god, or you might reincarnate, depending on the person that you're talking to. But it's the consciousness, that's the element that seems to be most important. Some define it as the mind itself. It seems if you look through history, a hell of a lot of people defined it as the mind, because one, they didn't even know that it was related to the brain. Look at the ancient Egyptians, for example. They ripped the brain out because they had no idea. Well, part of it was that they had no idea that that's actually where the where all the cognition, where the consciousness now
they
is
thought
shown
it was the
to come
heart,
from.
didn't they?
They did, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and that's why when you look at like even ancient Bible verses, they'll say like the heart is deceptive above all else.
Oh, but now
it's not talking about, like, now we think of like the heart as like this emotional thing. It was talking about it as like the seat of consciousness.
Yep.
It was talking about it as like
where your consciousness resides for now, kind of thing.
And the thing is, like, it made sense that they thought like that, because they're like, okay, what happens when we're emotional? We feel our heart race. And so they thought that was kind of like, a cause and effect. Sorry, no, they thought it was like the cause of the emotions rather than an effect of the emotions.
Yeah, I can totally see it. I mean, it's the middle of your body, it's, we know that if you damage the heart, you die. So that's another reason.
Some cultures think your stomach is like the seat of cognition.
Yes.
Because like as you talk, it's like all of your words seem to be bubbling up from like inside of you, from like your core. And so like the heart or like the stomach or something like that is where all your emotions rest, and that is where you're bubbling forth this idea.
Yeah. We have our gut feelings, you get butterflies in your tummy.
Yeah.
You guys, as well as the audience, to try something real quick for me. Just close your eyes and try to imagine your seat of vision, your seat of consciousness, as not being seated in your brain, but behind your head. Like all of your thoughts are happening behind you, and you're seeing from behind you. And now try to shift that down to your stomach. It's a really weird experiment. But if you really focus hard, you can kind of like imagine all of your thoughts taking place in your stomach, all of your perception and stuff taking place in, down from like your heart and stuff. So we know now that that's not the case. We know that this is happening in the brain. It's being processed in your brain. But if you don't know that, it is, it's possible for you to think of yourself like the location, the physical location of these thoughts being elsewhere in the body, even outside of your body.
Yeah.
But the problem emerges with, let's say, it started to kind of shift with this notion that like, if I punch you in the head, you lose consciousness. Like if I hit you in the right spot in your brain, like you black out. If you have like a headache, the pain is like, it's up in your head, and it will interfere with your thoughts and stuff.
Yep.
And this really started to, this field of neuroscience really started to kind of take a seat with, and this idea that like everything is rooted in the mind or in the brain, that it's not just this external phenomenon. When it came to the concept of your personality, because the personality was one of the things that was really, really deemed as being dictated by your soul. Your soul was your personality.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And we've talked about it in past episodes, the story of Phineas Gage.
Yep.
This happened in September 18th, 1848. There was an explosion, and it was an accidental explosion. I think he was working on a railroad, and a spike went through his brain, and his personality just completely changed. He survived the accident, but he just completely changed. And this isn't just a one-off case. There have been many instances where they would treat people with particular mood disorders by severing the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain in what's called a lobotomy. And they're cutting the connections in your brain, and it would alter your personality. It would alter your mood. Sometimes people would become really docile and quiet before they were extremely hyperactive. And another instance, what are some other ways you can alter your mood or your personality?
Drugs.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I'll do it.
Drugs.
Sleep,
have you ever heard of...
food?
Yeah?
Yep.
So like physical things.
Yeah. There's just anything that will alter the chemical...
Exercise.
Yeah, exercise is huge.
Like, I think I've mentioned it before, but whenever I go to the gym, I do these kind of like endorphin runs.
Yep,
which,
that's cool.
Yeah, they're like, little bits of kind of like fast walking with really fast running, and then walking and running, and then walking and running.
Interval training.
Yeah, pretty much. And like, of the space of like 20 minutes, half an hour, you get like a real high, a real rush from it.
Mm.
It's really, really fun.
Really good, yeah.
Yeah.
But drugs seem to be something that's really on topic there, kind of thing. If you take modafinil, you'll just be focused as fuck. If you
now, why is that?
I'm not entirely sure
about the chemistry behind it.
I don't know the chemistry of what it does there. I know the chemistry of other things, but
yeah, I don't know how that one works.
Yeah, with modafinil, I'm not entirely sure, or cognitive enhancers in general, I'm not exactly sure on what it does. Specifically, what it shuts down, what it increases. But if we take, there's certain other drugs. Caffeine's one.
Yeah.
But no, carry on. You were saying?
Oh, I was just going to mention like SSRIs, which literally inhibit it's in the name, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They reduce the amount of serotonin that your neurons kind of reuptake, so it's left floating around in the synapses a bit longer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You basically hit on it though, Steve, where it either inhibits certain things or it increases, it excites it.
Yeah.
And it's all chemistry.
Yeah.
It's all chemicals that are binding to certain receptors in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So this is physical.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not that you take a brain, it's not that you take like a drug and all of a sudden it's just that there's some ethereal aura that just like explodes throughout your body and sends shockwave. Like, it's all chemistry. It's all actual physical things that are made up of atoms that are binding chemically to other things made up of atoms.
And there's something else to be added, and that is most people's interaction with drugs is alcohol and caffeine. And caffeine doesn't quite do enough to really illustrate to you the point, but we assume that because alcohol is a drug and because it reduces our cognitive capacity, which kind of means that if we get more confident or if we act in a different way, we can put it down to the fact that we wasn't quite as privy to what we were doing as we otherwise would. Other drugs don't act like that, or at least a lot of them. Modafinil is a good example. To some extent, ecstasy is a good example. It just changes the distribution of chemicals in your mind. So on modafinil, you are just as conscious. It's just you act different, and you know you're acting different because all of a sudden you don't want to sit there and procrastinate, and it's not a choice. It's just you just don't want to do it. You want to be looking at X and Y and moving about, and it's amazing how much they do affect the mind, and of course that consequently affects your consciousness. What I would refer to as a soul. I wouldn't refer it to as a soul because the word soul is loaded and it's a bad word to use. I'd rather just get rid of it. But that's where I would say the soul resides, if it does at all.
So the personality is, that's basically a construct of the brain because it can be altered physically. And when you alter the brain, it changes your personality. You can figure out what part of your brain is firing and making you react particular ways, as well as your temporary mood states. Am I irritable right now here in this moment? Am I happy right now here in this moment? You can affect that with drugs. So if it's not your mood and it's not your personality, what else can you attribute to a soul?
Mood, consciousness.
Okay, consciousness. But you can
morals?
physically hit your brain. You can physically like smash someone in the head and they lose consciousness.
But somebody can say that what you've done there is damage the apparatus that the consciousness is using. It doesn't mean that the consciousness can't be an external factor in that sense. So, for example, you could damage my bicycle and I can't ride it, but that doesn't mean that the bicycle is me, if that makes sense.
Okay, what about when you are sleeping and they're imaging your brain while you're sleeping?
You could say, carry on.
And when you fall asleep, you lose consciousness and you see the brain waves, change and go to a steady state. But then when they start dreaming or when they hit REM or something, like you start to see them spike heavily. Like you're able to kind of pin it back to physical things that are happening in the brain. When people stare at things and they create like an image in their mind and they're thinking about things in their mind, you're able to see the electrical impulses that are taking place in the brain, the physical impulses that are taking place.
There's nothing to say that the consciousness doesn't need rest. So it could need rest, and that's just the way it manifests itself in our reality. You could say that. Another thing you could say is that just as, carrying on with the bicycle example, you have to stop once in a while in order to pump the tires up, in order to pull a few pebbles out of the tire or whatever it might be, calibrate the brakes. Well, the same is true of the body. The body that you're using, you could say it's the bike, and that is that it needs to recover, and that's what sleep is. There's lots of ad hoc things that can be added in.
Does the soul disappear when the consciousness disappears? If it is consciousness.
Yeah. So we could say, so you're asking, does the consciousness itself disappear?
Because if the soul is consciousness and it's separate from the body,
yes,
then when the body loses consciousness and you're completely unaware of everything else that's going on around you and your body is recouping, then why is your soul not separate from that? Why is your soul not kind of like looking over your body or like watching over it? Like if it's...
You could appeal to ignorance. You could say that it needs some kind of thing to latch onto in order to be functional at all. And when you sleep, it's no longer attached, and therefore that's what that blankness is. And then it will attach again as the body enables it when it's coming back to consciousness. And then you could say, people can basically say, and do in some extents, that consciousness can then manifest something else in a certain environment. So people that believe in reincarnation can say that consciousness then starts manifesting another animal. Or they can say it goes up to heaven and it manifests some kind of ethereal state and it activates again, where maybe that bike, that body, doesn't need to be calibrated because of the way it's made. And that's where you go there. That's the way I understand it from the people I've spoken to. Just to make it very clear, I think it's absolute bollocks, but I'm just trying to steel man it as it is.
You do have people who say they have like out of body experiences as well, and there's like astral projection and stuff. So like when your body's asleep, your soul is flying away, doing its own thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to touch on OBEs. Actually, I'll go ahead and dive into it. But if an out of body experience was something that is completely in your mind and isn't actually happening, like if you're not actually projecting a soul and you're just thinking about yourself being outside your body and you're just envisioning the world around you, that should be something that we should be able to recreate, no?
Not necessarily.
Like if it's something in your brain that is physically, your brain is doing some physical thing, whether it's a chemical reaction or something that's causing you to think that you're having an out-of-body experience, to see the world outside of you. If you were to induce that exact same mind state, you should experience an out-of-body experience, even if you're not having one, right?
Yeah, I think it could be possible to replicate it. It's just not going to be easy.
Okay.
Does that?
What if I told you that scientists can and do?
That's awesome.
Brilliant.
I'm not surprised.
I'm going to give you 3 examples. One of them is in an attempt to replicate some of the experiences, because when we talk about out-of-body experiences, it's really hard not to mention near-death experiences as well, because while you don't necessarily have an out-of-body experience when you have a near-death experience, oftentimes you do. Like, oftentimes they're coupled. Yeah. And sometimes, you know, people have, you know, had these out of body experiences through like meditation and other things. But oftentimes, like if you have a near death experience, you're hit by a car and you're rushed to the hospital and your heart stops and then they resuscitate you. People will say like, I crossed over to the other side. I saw, you know, the afterlife, and I had an out of body experience, and I even rose above the operating table and saw people operating on me. Okay. Well, when you're in a state like that, when you're, you know, whatever's happening in your brain, if you're still able to hear what's going on in the room, if you're still able to feel things that are happening to you, then like your body is still taking in those sensory inputs. It's still taking in some of the information around you. Now, in these cases, when there are near-death experiences, what scientists look for is not like, just did this person say that they had an out-of-body experience? They look for something that is veridical, that they could not have otherwise experienced. So if someone has a near-death experience and they float above the table and they see that somebody had like, oh, they were wearing red shoes and they did this and they said this and I saw all this other stuff in the room around me. Well, the scientist then asks, well, when they woke up, were they then able to take in all of that stuff? Before they went under, did they see any of that stuff? Like, what could they have only gotten while they were, you know, basically in a comatose-like state when their heart stopped? And here it gets kind of tricky, because when you go into like when people are using like an EEG to, like, you know, measure your brain activity, like an EEG only measures like the outer layers of the brain. It doesn't really stare deep into, you know, the inner workings. So like when a scientist when a doctor pronounces you as like officially dead, and then they're able to revive you afterwards, well, it's like, well, you weren't really technically dead. Like, they brought you back. Like, there was still some level of you know, electrical activity, you know, deep inside your brain that caused you to be able to be resuscitated. Like, there had to be something that was still there. And when they look for cases of veridical NDEs, the evidence for them is shoddy at best. So there are a lot of cases of near-death experiences. There's a lot of cases of out-of-body experiences. But as far as veridical NDEs that have been confirmed by doctors, like, there really isn't any. There's like one story that was put forth. I'm blanking on the name of this guy, but I did a whole video on near-death experiences where afterwards he came forward and he basically said like it was a hoax.
Yeah, okay.
And then there was another case where this woman claimed that her body left the hospital room and she saw this shoe that was like sitting outside on a ledge, and it's like, oh, she couldn't possibly have seen that. But then there were some other researchers that went to the room and they couldn't find the original woman, and it was just seemed a little sketch. And then they looked from the window and they were able to see the shoe, and like, just really like enough to make you kind of skeptical. It's, you know, very anecdotal at best. But where it starts to get really sketch, this notion of out-of-body experiences, and where people say, oh, it's separate. You have this soul that's completely separate from your body. Well, the fact that we're able to replicate that in a lab, and we're able to stimulate parts of the brain and cause you to experience an out-of-body experience, like, really just, it screams that this is a physiological thing that is happening inside of your brain. There's a neurological explanation. Have you guys ever heard of the God helmet?
Yeah.
No. I've not.
Steve?
I've as soon as I said yes, I was like, yeah, I have heard of that, but I think I'm going to be thinking of the wrong thing. So
there's a guy named Dr. Michael Persinger, and in his lab, he scanned a bunch of brains and stuff and tried to figure out like where these kind of supernatural experiences, these out-of-body experiences, like, where is it coming from? And he noticed that if he were to, like, he created this helmet that would stimulate I think it was the temporal lobe of patients, and it caused them it recreated these supernatural experiences, and even in some cases out-of-body experiences, where the people would just feel this extremely like supernatural experience, or this, you know, overwhelmingly emotional experience, sometimes fear, And sometimes even they would feel like they were outside of their own body, which is crazy. There's
really
another
crazy.
scientist, Dr. Olaf Blanc, that used electrodes to do basically the same thing. And in centrifuges, when they have like in Air Force training and stuff, they'll spin you around super, super fast, accelerate you up to like this really high level G-force. And they find that as your brain experiences a state of hypoxia, that you can experience, you know, all of this stuff from like tunnel vision to kind of near-death experience, like, you know, supernatural stuff, hallucinations, out-of-body experiences. And they found that some of it, like if you put like glasses on the eyes that kind of counteract some of the pressure that's happening, that the tunnel vision goes away. But like there's different things that they can pinpoint to different experiences, physical things that they can stimulate.
It's a bit like the opposite of drugs, I guess, because in that case they're overloading the senses, they're overloading the person, and then it breaks, and you know they hallucinate, etc. Whereas with drugs, it just breaks down your natural capacity to deal with ordinary life without tripping, and you just trip at really basic stuff, and it seems like it's doing the same thing. One just weakens your defense, your resilience, whereas one just overdoes it. They just go well and above your defense.
Yeah. Well, and that's where when you look at drugs like DMT or ketamine, they can also stimulate hallucinations and supernatural experiences. And I think ketamine even stimulated OBEs, but I'd have to double check that. But it's interesting because ketamine binds to the same receptors as some naturally occurring neurological chemicals in your brain. And so all of this kind of basically screams the fact that like these out-of-body experiences, these near-death experiences, like if they can be recreated naturally through either lack of oxygen, hypoxia, through chemical release and hallucinations, through, you know, some type of electrical stimulation, like if there's all these different ways that we can, you know, scientists may not know exactly what's happening because it's really hard to image someone's brain while they're, you know, going into cardiac arrest and they're like on the table being brought back. You know, that's not when doctors are like, hey, let's get an fMRI over here and scan this person's brain.
Yeah.
They wouldn't even be still enough for them to get a good image.
Yeah.
Like,
and
so
if that's, you know, we're kind of at this impasse where scientists basically say like, look, we can recreate this in healthy patients. We know that the framework is there for us to give you the same type of supernatural experiences. We know that there's people who have, like there was one guy who had temporal lobe epilepsy, and that caused him to have these extremely supernatural like experiences where he started assigning to just everyday objects like this massive amount of like salience, and everything was significant and everything was emotional, and he thought that he was God. And he even like ran out in the streets and he was like yelling like, you know, I'm a fucking God or something like that. And the neighbors, or his dad's like, get in here, the neighbors are going to call the cops on you. And he walked inside, but he said afterwards, he's like, I just kind of laughed because I'm like, you can't call the cops on God.
Oh, God.
But you know that when you're able to pinpoint, and this is replicatable, like it's always the same, you know, the same regions cause the same things in different people. You know, we've talked before about how psychopaths that lack empathy, that lack the ability to add some emotional significance to certain actions and care about other people, that oftentimes there is either a decrease in the size of the amygdala or a decrease in the functioning, the pathways, the interactions between the amygdala and other parts of the brain are damaged, and which causes people to act out in maybe violent ways, and it alters their personality. Yeah. So you tie all of this back to a physical substance, a brain. And it's like, well, what is there left for the soul to do? Okay. What about memories?
Brain.
Again, it's brain.
Yeah.
Something
we know
that
where the brain like creates memories. We know how the brain essentially creates memories. We know there are different parts of the brain for short and long-term memories. We know people with, you know, damage in certain parts of the brain who can't create new memories. We know people who lost their old memories.
Amnesia, etc. We can it's in the same area. We know if you damage that point, your memories will go.
Yeah.
the most potent argument against a soul that I've ever heard, and to me it's pretty much ironclad, is from Sam Harris. And he said, we are at a state now where we know that if you damage certain parts of the brain, it directly affects anything that we would call a soul, be that our memories, be that our consciousness, our personality, all of the things that you've just mentioned, any of it. We know that it's related to the brain almost entirely. We know if you destroy a certain part, that is gone in that person, especially with certain parts. It doesn't come back. And yet people want to believe, somehow believe, that when we die, which is to say when the entire brain is dead, somehow that all comes back together and rises off the body. That there is no reason to think that, and every reason to think that your consciousness ends with your brain. And that's an unfortunate bitter pill for a lot of people to swallow. It was, but that observation there was just the nail in the coffin for me. I was like, yeah, well, that's that.
Yeah. Well, and to get back, for a lot of people, they say that the soul, it somehow holds on to your memories. But like you guys were talking about, I mean, a great example of this kind of being proven false is people with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Who, they lose the ability to have short-term working memory or long-term memory. Like there was a guy, his name was Clive Waring, and he had one of the worst cases of amnesia where he had both anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So he lost his old memories, or a lot of them, and he lost the ability to form new memories because he had a rare case of the herpes viral encephalitis that attacked part of his brain.
That sucks.
And if you look at, like, for I think over a decade, he was journaling, and he always felt like he had just woken up from some type of like hypercomatose state. And he was really angry for a while, and he kept writing in his journal. He said, I am now awake. I am now definitely awake. I know I'm awake now. Like, I have to be awake. Like, I know I'm awake. I am now awake. And it was just the same stuff every single day, again and again and again. And
what a struggle.
Eventually he, and if you see conversations with this guy, it's like his wife will come in, and he recognizes her because, like, apparently that was one area that was unaffected, but he doesn't really know that he has a kid. Or he knows he has a kid, but he doesn't know what he does. And so, like, she'll say, do you know what your son does? And he's like, oh, no, what does he do? Oh, he's a mechanical engineer. Oh, that's brilliant. He does this. Oh, well, that's a great idea. Do you know anyone who does this? Oh, no, I don't. Your son does. Oh, how that's, fantastic. That's brilliant. Like, in the course of one conversation, he's just completely unaware of anything 10 seconds earlier. And so, you see these cases, it's like, well, what is there left? It's like you're almost like a shell of a person at that point. Like, without your memories, what do you build on? But he as the time went on, like, the anger subsided, and he kind of became more relaxed and, kind of more at peace. And his personality was still there. Like, he was still friendly. He was still fun loving. He was still able to play the piano because that's, procedural memory rather than declarative memory. It's kind of a separate memory pathway.
I know what argument but people that advocate for a soul would give you, or one that they would give you. And they would say, well, that just means that the bike's damaged, if you will, to go back to the analogy that I used before. It's like the soul's still in there. The frustration you're seeing is that it cannot communicate via this vessel anymore. Again, it sounds like a really reasonable answer, but it's just ad hoc. It's just completely pulled out of someone's arse. The problem is that we can't make the assumption that there's a soul and then say, prove that it's not the case. Oh, well, you haven't accounted for this, you haven't accounted for that, which is essentially what I'm saying there, where I go, well, maybe the body is too much in a state where, or the brain is, that the consciousness can accurately convey itself. It's not good enough to have it that way around. This is where the burden of proof is important. Yeah. The person who makes the assertion that we have a soul has all of the burden to prove it. It's not about the other person being able to show demonstrably, verifiably 100% that it can't be in X or Y or Z. But
yeah. Well, and as you slowly start to chip away at each one of these functions, like another great case of memory was the most famous neuroscience patient. His name was HM, or at least that's what he was called in the literature. And he had basically an operation, I think it was to prevent seizures, and they removed his hippocampus. And as a result, the seizures did go away because that's where, they were most active, but he also lost his ability to form new memories. And so like they were able, that's where he had one of the most studied brains in history. It was imaged like, I think hundreds, if not thousands of times. And they were able to kind of pinpoint that location was responsible for forming new memories. And so, as you start to pinpoint each one of these regions that affect specific things, that have specific functions, that do specific things, that, affect our moods, that affect our personalities, then it's like, well, what is left? Well, we have our senses, but those are physical too. And we'll talk next week. Rachel's doing an episode on the senses. How many senses do we have? Where are they rooted? What causes, us to have things? What makes a sense? And every single one of your senses is linked to a specific thing. So you have like your vision, and you can break this down into pieces, and you can say like, okay, like if you damage the hardware, you damage the eyeballs or the retina, if it detaches or something, like it's gonna affect what you see. It's gonna affect your ability to see. But then if you have perfectly functioning eyes, but you damage the connection between the eyes and the occipital lobe, well, you're not going to be able to form a conscious visual perception of something. Mm-hmm. There's other pathways too. And there's like 30 different regions of the brain that are associated with eyesight, or to varying degrees, varying aspects of it. But if you damage, let's say, the Wernicke's area of the brain, you're not going to be able to have a coherent conversation or process information as you hear a conversation. Is just going to be like, gobbledygook to you, and you're not going to be able to form coherent sentences. So you take these different aspects of your brain that are responsible for processing different senses. It's like, well, we know that's all physical. We know that is tied to these physical regions. So what is left for the soul to do? Body image? Like your thought of like, who am I? Like my image in space and stuff. Well, that can be affected physically too.
I do think people are too kind of sentimental about this idea of like a soul or a personality, and kind of put it up on this pedestal as being special and separate from all our other bodily functions.
They need it to be.
Yeah.
Without it, if you don't believe in some form of a soul, you've accepted that you will go back to the state in which you was during 1822. That is, you won't exist.
Hey, I was alive then. Weren't you?
Did not know you were that young, Rachel. But yeah, it's a difficult one. Our cultures, and we've evolved as well to basically think that our consciousness will continue to exist.
Yeah.
Our soul will continue to exist. But the problem is that there is no evidence for it, and at this point, there's mounting evidence to the contrary. Yeah. So to the reasonable mind, the only thing you can actually reasonably conclude is that this is it, and that's okay.
I guess, though, it's not just people wanting to feel like they're special, but also people wanting to, like, kind of separate themselves from animals in some way. Because it's not just a matter of, like, why is this biological process somehow more special than this biological process? It's like, why is our consciousness somehow better than a dog's consciousness? And people are like, oh, because we have a soul and, you know, this animal doesn't. It is kind of like people wanting a status.
Yeah, no, it is. I've met like lots of people that say, well, humans are basically, top of the evolutionary ladder. And I have to say, no, there isn't a ladder in evolution. No. But they say, well, no one's as intelligent as us. And they don't, it's really hard to get this point across to a lot of people.
Depends how you define intelligence.
It's even worse than that. That's an arbitrary trait to select. Yeah. It's like a giraffe standing there going, look at all of these peons, these pathetic species. They've got nowhere near the neck length that we do.
Yeah.
It's like,
or mantis shrimps being like, what's
matter?
with these guys only having 3 cone cells? We have like however many it is, like 9, 12, something.
It's just arbitrary. It's sure, it's our brain that's made us an apex predator, allowed us to become incredibly popular, as in populated around the world and to dominate countless geographic regions. But if you want to say that the best is that which can dominate in that sense, well, then viruses, insects, ants are everywhere. Therefore the whoever's got the, I don't know what sense, talking of sense, I don't know what sense ants have, but they have a pheromone relationship that's social with other ants. Maybe that's how you, but anyway, I'm getting well on a tangent here. So
well, it's like, what about higher level thinking and abstraction and being able to contemplate our place in the universe and to, have a theory of mind and to, have some level of self-awareness and to think in terms of like metaphors and whatnot. Like these are all things that are very unique to humans.
So far as we know, yeah.
And you can look at the different regions of the brain that we have that say chimps don't, and things like the angular gyrus, which is way larger in humans than chimps and other great apes, and it has these associations with like higher thinking and abstraction and stuff. And you look at areas like Wernicke's area, also unique to humans, and it allows us to think in to comprehend language and create sophisticated sonnets and things. And, so there's areas of complexity that are layered on top of complexity, and we can look at this and see it as further along in the evolutionary process towards being able to comprehend the universe, having a higher chance of survival, of outliving the next great extinction event.
They're not the same thing, though, are they?
How so?
Because being able to survive.
What isn't?
Being able to survive and being able to understand the universe.
It's not, but if we have higher levels of thinking, we're more likely able to build tools and augment our intelligence.
Absolutely.
And push for transhumanism and create a more survivable species.
Yeah.
I think here there's a difference between surviving
save
and
other
thriving.
species in the process.
Of course, absolutely. It's a really good mechanism that we have, and it's incredibly flexible, which is awesome. It can be applied in so many areas.
Yeah.
But it's still arbitrary to say that is basically what
the best thing.
Yeah, it's completely arbitrary, but it is a very good once we define what good is.
It's like if the dung beetle were like, life's purpose is to collect the most poo.
Yeah.
I am the best, the very best animal.
And they're like, what are these humans doing? Throwing it all away. Except you, Thomas.
That has to look odd to a dog. It's like, you know what? I don't understand them. They keep going into this room where they have this porcelain throne where they spend all this time every single day collecting their poo, and then they just flush it down the toilet? Like, why?
Yeah, that's
I know, Kyra must be like, why don't you have someone to come pick it up after you like I do?
Yeah.
It is.
Or to a squirrel, if like you have a pecan tree and it just drops all these nuts on the ground and it's like, they just leave them there? Like, are you crazy?
Just a quick question.
Gold mine of...
I was just going to ask, just a quick question. If there was terrible events on Earth, let's just say a meteorite or two hit the Earth and really mess things up, do you think there's more chance that humans will survive that, or that organism you spoke about before that can live in space with no water for 10 years?
The tardigrade?
Yeah. Because to me, if you want to see a successful evolutionary organisms, that's it. That's going to out-survive a human almost definitely.
Yeah. In that case, our ability to write sonnets means nothing.
Our capacity to say I think, therefore I am, means fuck all. So
here's the thing, though, is let's say that the human race survives for 100,000 years and continues at the same exponential rate of technological advancement as far as is possible within the realm of physics.
Yeah.
Then if let's say that we expand out into the cosmos and we colonize, tons and tons of other planets, and we terraform them, and we go to other solar systems, and and all of a sudden we're all throughout the galaxy, then, well, most likely, there's going to be tardigrades that we bring with us, and they're going to survive. But let's say that we don't do that, and we just stay here on Earth. And let's say that if, a few billion years from now, that the sun like expands outward and completely engulfs our planet and just sterilizes everything on it. Well, the tardigrade and us and anything else that's around is going to be screwed. And So it's like, yeah, the tardigrade is like, if we survive, the tardigrade probably will too. But most likely, if we don't colonize other planets, and unless another animal surpasses us evolutionarily, which is unlikely right now in terms of ability to travel, for traveling through space and whatnot, then yeah, we are kind of this planet's best shot right now at spreading through the universe and surviving.
There's a couple of things I just
inevitable extinction.
It's because we have flown to space and to the moon. We have, get over it. Because we have done space exploration, people seem to jump quite easily to the idea that we're going to colonize other places. I think that challenge is going to be a lot harder than we think. It may.
That's why we need to focus more on it and spend more money on it and try harder.
I agree with you, but it doesn't make money, and it doesn't have the public's eye. Hopefully, podcasts such as this and increasing interest will change that fact. But
it doesn't make money yet.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. It did at one point. It made money during the Cold War because there was competition, and that's why why America got to the moon.
So I have this old I can't remember like what book it is. But it's a book from like the late 70s, early 80s or something, and it's like, what will the world look like by like 2010? And it was like, maybe we'll be growing food on Mars, not on Mars, on the moon, and shipping it back to Earth. And then like reading it now, I'm like, oh,
it's
such
weird,
big
isn't
dreams.
it? They always get so much wrong, and they underestimate other areas. So you go back to those times, and there's predictions like that. Not many of them predicted that we would all have basically a supercomputer in our pockets. It's really hard to know where the technology's going to go, and like the utility of it all. It's really quite incredible. I've just thought of a topic that I probably will do next if you guys are interested, but it just relates to what I was saying about humans not being able to necessarily survive certain extinctions. There's been 5 extinctions, mass extinctions, in the history of the Earth, and the species that survive are the most malleable, which means the most simple. Complex species almost always falter bad under those circumstances. But it's interesting because because we can conceive what's going on, we would know why we're dying, probably. So if we take, for example, the dinosaurs, a hell of a lot of them died because they needed sunlight. They needed access to sunlight. They needed the vitamins, and a lot of them were, cold-blooded, etc. So, in fact, I think most of them were. Well, they didn't have the knowledge to think, we need to find a way to get hold of it, whereas humans would, and we would spend our resources making it so that we can get some kind of capacity to find it, or to find it through an artificial means.
They couldn't synthetically create what they wanted, whereas we do have that ability to. Like,
exactly.
It might take us some time. A big chunk of our species might be wiped out, but I don't think it's likely that we'd all just kind of disappear straight away.
No, I don't either. It's an interesting... I mean, there's certain things that I'm very much convinced would utterly obliterate humans. But you're right. With just the mind, it is an incredibly useful tool.
I want to pull back to kind of the notion of the soul, just a couple more points before we wrap up. And one of them was, you talked about consciousness, and it seems to me like consciousness is kind of the one last area where they have, a little bit of an argument. And I wanted to kind of put a couple nails in that coffin. And the first part is that certain things, your conscious awareness of them is based off of, I want to show that it's based off of the brain. And it's based off of, one, the sensations and the input that the brain gets, but also its ability to process it. So in order to cover this, I want to look at, first of all, hang on. First, I want to look at asteriognosis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it is the inability to recognize objects by touching them without sensory inputs. So, like, let's say that you have this, and I give you an object like an ice cube, and you feel the ice cube in your hand. You're able, most people are able to kind of judge its shape and its size just by touching it. You have kind of the sense of like proprioception, like where are your fingers in space? Like you can kind of feel how big the object is. You can feel how cold it is. You can feel the water running down your hands, and you're like, okay, I think this is an ice cube. But someone who has asteriognosis is unable to do that. And it's usually because there's some type of damage to the superior parietal lobule. And it gets kind of crazy because it can affect one side of your body and not the other, or both. So depending on the location and the extent of the damage to the brain. So if I were to give you an ice cube in your right hand and you had damage on the left side of your brain, you wouldn't be able to tell this. Like you're not really able to tell like what is in your hand. You're missing the ability to really know what's going on. So you're not really consciously aware of some of the input that most people get through their senses. Now that's not really consciousness, but there are other aspects of consciousness that you can link to different regions of your brain. So another condition is called hemispatial neglect. Have you heard of this?
I've not, no.
Where someone will have, like let's say that I put a plate of food in front of you. You might eat the entire right half of the plate and leave the left untouched.
I have heard of this.
And you could still complain and be like, I'm so hungry, like I want food, I'm starving. And you won't even notice that it's there until someone flips the plate around and you see the other half, and then you eat it. So you could say that you are not consciously aware of an entire hemisphere of what's going on. And here's where it gets crazy. Is that, so this occurs when there's damage to the parietal lobe, but it's the right-sided spatial neglect is much more rare, because when you're processing, what's happening is when you process the right side, it's being processed in the left side of your brain. So there's like kind of a crossover, but there's some redundancy in space that the right space is processed by both the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. Whereas like whatever's happening with, in most left dominant brains, the left space is only processed by the right cerebral hemisphere. And so you can literally look at this condition where people only are able to really see one half, and sometimes they'll draw a picture and they'll only draw half of the picture.
Wow.
Or they'll only put makeup on half of their face or comb half of their hair. And it's like they're not really able to notice what's going on the other side until like they turn their head, or it's their attention is drawn to it.
What about like getting dressed? Did they ever just put like one arm in clothes?
I think that would more be like muscle memory.
Okay.
But I don't know. Like, I think it's more when they're actually actively focusing on something. But I'm not sure. That's a good question. But the fact that that right-sided spatial neglect is more rare because it's processed in both hemispheres, but left-side spatial neglect is much more common because it doesn't have that redundancy, and so it only takes like a little bit of trauma to one side rather than to both sides. Then it's like that just shows you that like this is a very, very, very region-specific function of consciousness. So you're not even aware of something that's going on one side of your brain because of, this part of the brain is damaged. Like it links consciousness literally to a specific physical portion of the brain. And there's different aspects. Go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say that for me, consciousness is definitely linked to the brain, and you can just look at the studies done by Benjamin Libet and Sion Soon, which was mentioned in the free will episode that we did. And just to me, it basically the test showed that before you make a conscious decision using EEG and fMRI, people can know way before you do, like in some cases by 10 seconds, what your decision is going to be before you consciously make it. That's before you even consciously know it, which means that there's something seriously going on in the brain before you think you've made that decision. So to me, consciousness is definitely in the brain. It's really, really likely.
One last condition I kind of want to draw attention to is Capgras delusion. Have you ever heard of that?
It sounds familiar.
No.
I think I may have mentioned it in a past episode, but it's where people think that their mother is an imposter.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And so they're consciously aware of someone that walks in the room and they're like, it looks like my mom or it looks like my dad or my girlfriend or whatever, but this person is an imposter. And there were a couple of theories about this. One of them was kind of Freudian, and they're like, oh, everyone wants to sleep with their mother and that urge goes away. And so therefore, there's this mismatch. But that's like, it's not only weird, but there was like one case where like a guy had Capgras delusion with his pet poodle. And it's like, unless you want to start speculating about the inherent bestiality in all of us, then it's, going a little bit far. And the other thing is that when they talk on the phone with their mom or their dad, there's no delusion there. Like, they're like, oh yeah, hey, how are you doing? Everything's perfectly normal. And then they'll see them in person and there's like this person's an imposter, and they flip out. And sometimes they'll even think that they're houses.
Yeah, do you think that's linked in some way to the people who can't match up like names and faces?
And I was also going to suggest that might be linked to people that are sensitive to the uncanny valley. Just doesn't quite make sense to you.
It's a little bit different in that, so when someone has, when they're not able to recognize faces, what's happening is that they have damage to the fusiform gyrus itself. And so this is the part of the brain that recognizes the faces, it sees the patterns, it's like, oh, that's that person. And in those people, in those instances, they're consciously aware that they're not able to recognize the faces. They're not like delusional about it. They know that they can't recognize it, and they'll try to see other things like the color of their shoes or something to try to figure out who's who, or the sound of their voice. With Capgras delusion, it's because there's a kind of damage between the fusiform gyrus and the amygdala, which is responsible for the emotional reaction that we get when processing the images. So they'll look at them, they'll recognize it as their mother, they'll see the faces, they know that it looks like their mother, or it looks like their dad or their house or their pet poodle, but there's no emotional response. And one way that they were able to test this was there's a neurologist, V.S. Ramachandran, and he measured the galvanic skin response of people when staring at different images of just neutral objects like a chair versus that they wouldn't react to emotionally at all, or to like a guitar that they have no stress response to. And then they get like a baseline of different things that should create, a stress response, and to make sure that it's functioning normally and properly. And then they'll put up images of like their mom or their dad or their dog. And they found that there was no emotional response. And so the person they were thinking it was an imposter. And even though they were technically awake and aware and alert and conscious, certain things that they should have known, that they should have had these responses to, because there was a specific region of the brain that's damaged or a pathway that's damaged, they lose this ability. And it always happens like after an accident or trauma to the brain or a stroke or something. And so it links it back more to the physical world. Like all of these things that we have, like people say, oh, we don't know that, oftentimes people arguing for the soul, they're like, well, we don't know that the mind is a construct of the brain. It's like, well, that's not true. There's a difference between knowing exactly how it's constructed, like the hard problem of consciousness, and knowing that it is constructed. And an example of this I like to give is like, if I show you a computer or a light bulb, and you may not know exactly how the light bulb is generating, light. You may not know exactly how electricity is rushing to it and causing it to give off, this light, but you do know that it requires electricity to generate light. You know that if you shut off the power, the light goes out. If you unplug it, the light goes off. You turn off the switch, the light goes off. You know that it requires the electricity to generate it. You know that the light bulb is generating the light. You just don't know the functioning of it. And so when a neuroscientist says, well, we know that the mind is a construct of the brain, we know it's generated by the brain, well, they may not know every single last detail. We're working on it. We're putting all the pieces together, but they don't necessarily, that doesn't mean that they don't know that the mind is generated by the brain, that, when the brain is damaged or various parts of the brain are damaged, that you don't lose all the different functions associated with it, and that the mind isn't affected by the brain.
You see this so often in people which are making appeals to ignorance. It's basically, we don't know everything, therefore we know nothing. That's not the case. It's like we know a hell of a lot, That's basically what science does. It's why it's called scientific theories, and rather than scientific facts. We've, of course, covered this before, but yeah.
It was like in my episode on abiogenesis, how, just because a scientist doesn't know beyond a shadow of a doubt how life got here, that doesn't mean that they don't have a clue. That doesn't, it means that there is an abundance of data, an abundance of possibilities that they can put forth, not an absence of ideas.
Yeah.
The same with evolution though. When people say like, oh, there's a missing link here, it's like, yeah, but we have all the others. You can't just discount everything because we don't have one thing. It's like saying we're not going to treat a broken arm because we don't know how to treat cancer yet. It's like there's a whole field. It's like you don't necessarily need every single piece in place to be certain of the other pieces.
It's even worse with that claim as well, because it's, we had Australopithecus afarensis and, of course, Homo sapien. They went, where's the missing link? And it's like, oh, look what we've just found, Homo habilis. They go, oh, well, now you've got 2 missing links. It's like, really? So you go, oh, okay, let's do some more research. And you find, Homo neanderthalensis. And they go, well, now you got 4 missing links. It's like, I'm sorry, but you're not playing the game properly. This is knocking over the pieces and shitting over the board. Let's cease this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, it would be like if someone breaks their neck and they become paralyzed because they have a spinal injury. And for you to come along and say like, oh, just because we don't know exactly every single aspect of, all of the inner workings of the spine, and maybe we don't know this one detail, therefore, like, the spine isn't responsible. Breaking the spine isn't responsible for them becoming paralyzed, even though there's like hundreds of thousands of people that this happened to again and again and again. It's like, no, we know that this spinal injury led to the paralysis. It caused the paralysis, even if we don't know 100% of all the inner workings of it.
Yeah, it goes down to the knowledge thing. It's like this idea that we should have 100% knowledge. Again, we don't have 100% knowledge in anything other than the fact that you exist in some form. And by you, I do mean just you. As in, I know I exist. I cannot prove 100% that you do. I cannot. So, and the same is for you if you exist.
To be fair, Stephen, neither me or you have met Thomas, so how do we know he exists?
Oh, exactly.
He could just be a weird, very intelligent computer program tricking us right now.
Well, he is that, but also he might be a human.
What?
Whoever wrote my programming deserves to win an award for passing the Turing test.
No, I'm not
just
fooled.
passing, but hopefully blowing it out of the water. Although, so I wanted to kind of wrap this up with, one final question, and that's, why does an immaterial mind or a soul that's supposedly not bound in space somehow have to be bound to a physical body that goes where you go? Why is that the case? And you could technically argue that, Descartes is right. All of this stuff that you're trying to prove through the physical world, all of these examples, all this, empirical data and testing and time again, we're proving this consistency throughout, all of our experiments that, there's no evidence for a soul, but we could just be living in a matrix that it applies to those rules, and we're in a simulation, and we only know that our mind exists, and therefore it could be some external thing that then can be uploaded into another program or into another body or something. You could argue that, but you're violating the burden of proof. You're violating Occam's razor. You're putting forth a whole lot of speculations without any basis in evidence. And you really have to kind of get your feet back on the ground and be grounded in reality of like, this is what we know how the world works. This is how we test that the world works the way that it does. These are the consistent results that we get. And if you put forth some wild speculation or theory like that, it might be cute in the world of philosophy, but it's,
it don't cut
it's
it
not
in science.
Practical.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not practical. It doesn't belong in science unless you can satisfy the burden of proof.
Yeah,
exactly. So you got that foundational burden of proof, which is at the foundation, of course. But people think it's possible, therefore it's is in the realm of science, and it's like, no, it's in the realm of science, but science focuses on probability, not possibility. At least the practice of it. So the reason why certain theories are considered true is because the probability of it is so high because it accurately accounts for the vast majority of facts that we do have in relation to it, and it has made successful predictions. The fact that something's possible, is it possible that all of this information is wrong and that we do actually rise off the brain? Yeah, it's possible, but there is no reason to think that. So that's that.
Well, and it gets back to like the idea of like, can you prove the existence of God?
Yeah.
It's like, well, or can you disprove God? Well,
yeah, it's exactly. That's not
really like nobody can disprove that. It's not falsifiable. It's like it could be completely immaterial, doesn't affect the natural world at all. It's just ethereal, and it's somehow like floating through space, and like we can't ever test it, measure it, whatever. Well, but then it's basically identical to something that's non-existent, and that like we can't test or disprove it.
Yeah.
And if you can't disprove it, I mean, I could be a brain slug that's living on your mind and implanting all of these conversations in your brain and making you think this. But until you come up with a way to falsify that notion, then it really is completely impractical. It gets you nowhere. It's useless. Except as a fun thing for philosophers to think about while getting stoned.
Yeah.
Nice. Oh. On a completely unrelated note, can I share something exciting?
Yes.
And this isn't related to science, but like 15 minutes ago, my phone started ringing quite a lot, and I looked at my messages, and it turns out I'm going to be an auntie again.
Oh, congratulations.
Oh.
So I'm very excited. I just wanted to tell you too.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So if I go on social media and I post that I predict that, and then this episode airs Saturday, does that mean I'm psychic?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. So I want to wrap up here because that episode's starting to stretch on, but just real quick in summary. So we covered mind-body dualism, Cartesian, this Cartesian notion that the mind is separate from the body. We looked at a couple of reasons that Descartes put that forth, including like the I can doubt my mind, or I can doubt my body but not my mind, which violated the masked man fallacy. And then we looked at some of the ways people tried to prove the soul, including Dr. McDougall's 21 grams theory,
photographing the soul,
Korotkov's weird camera trying to photograph the soul that was some weird BS. And we talked about OBE's near-death experiences, as well as what does the soul do? What does it generate? And we showed that all of that can be linked to the physical brain, and there's not really anything left for the soul to do, for it to be responsible for. So I'm still open to the notion of a soul. I'm still open to that idea, but I think there's a massive burden of proof that it has yet to accomplish.
Yeah.
And if people have proof that they want to show me that's not just some weird conspiracy theorist page, then send it my way. I'd love to see it.
On this topic, a book I'd really recommend if people want to read more is a book called Descartes' Error by, I think it's Antonio Damasio. I'm pretty sure I've recommended it before, but it pretty much talks about this whole topic, and it's really interesting. So
also check out Phantoms in the Mind by Dr. V.S. Ramachandran and The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Oddities.
Oh, I want to read that.
Fantastic book. And I mean, there's a couple more, but there's also a great documentary, Secrets of the Mind, and I'll put some other links to some cool resources that people can check out to learn like the different types of like aphasia and more about Cartesian dualism and the story of HM and stuff like that.
Be cool to add maybe the wiki entry to Phileas Gage as well.
Yeah.
He's an interesting character, definitely.
Very interesting. Pretty much the birth of neuroscience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as well as I'll put a link to a story about Clive Waring, who had the anterograde and retrograde amnesia.
Oh, yeah.
And the story of HM, whose brain was altered and he lost his memories.
Cool beans.
But until next week, when Rachel will be talking about our senses and how many do we have? Do we have more than 5? What are they? If so, what makes a sense a sense? And it's going to be spectacular! This has been an absolute blast, and now we want you to join in the conversation over on the Here and How Facebook and Twitter pages, or follow us on Pinterest and Instagram if you just want some of the dankest of sciencey memes. If you like one of our particular styles, check out each of our YouTube channels: Rachel Oates, Rationality Rules by Stephen Woodford, and Holy Kool-Aid by me, Thomas Westbrook. To find all of our episodes, show notes, contact information, and more, warp on over to our home base, thehereandhow.com. If you enjoyed this episode and want us to succeed in spreading the love of science, you can help us out by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher. And to all our friends and family listening, thank you for spending this episode with us. We'll be back to explore another exciting big idea next week. Now go create something magnificent.